Welcome to Readings in English, where learning English becomes an adventure through stories that touch the heart and open the mind. English is an incredibly versatile language spoken by millions around the world. It's a bridge that connects cultures, ideas, and people across every corner of the globe. But learning English isn't just about understanding words and grammar. It's about diving into a whole new way of seeing the world. Here, we explore English through meaningful stories that offer more than vocabulary. They offer insights, emotions, and experiences that bring the language to life. Today's story is Finding Friendship. This is a heartfelt tale of Pierre, a young exchange student from France who finds himself in a new country surrounded by a language he struggles to understand. With the help of a new friend, James, Pierre learns that language isn't just about words. It's about connection, courage, and discovering who you are. As Pierre's journey unfolds, you'll see how English becomes more than a subject for him. It becomes a bridge to friendship and a path to self-discovery. So get comfortable and let's dive into the story of finding friendship. Listen closely and maybe, just maybe, you'll find that learning English is a journey that connects us all. Pierre tightened his grip on his backpack as he stepped off the school bus and gazed at the imposing building before him. The bustling crowd of students moved with ease, their laughter and conversations merging into a language he struggled to follow. His heart raced as he wondered how he would find his way in a place where every word felt foreign. Stepping inside, Pierre tried to recall the phrases he'd practiced with his parents back in France. Hello, excuse me, and thank you felt familiar in theory, but lost their comfort in the face of a fast-moving crowd. He attempted a polite nod to a passing student, but they barely glanced in his direction, too wrapped up in their own conversations. The school bell rang, jolting him from his thoughts. Following the stream of students, he found his way to his first class. The English teacher introduced him, her voice kind yet hurried as she explained he was an exchange student from France. Pierre felt the heat rise in his cheeks as everyone turned to look, a mixture of curiosity and mild disinterest in their faces. Welcome, Pierre, she said warmly. Please, take a seat next to James. Pierre spotted James, a boy with a confident smile, gesturing for him to sit. Relieved to have a designated spot, Pierre took his seat and attempted a small smile. James returned it, leaning over with an easy nod. Don't worry. It'll get easier, James whispered, giving Pierre a reassuring wink. Pierre nodded, grateful for the kindness, but unable to reply without stumbling over his words. Class began, and the teacher launched into a discussion that Pierre could barely keep up with. Each sentence she spoke seemed to blur into the next, leaving him straining to catch familiar phrases or words he understood. As the minutes dragged on, he felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. This was nothing like the English lessons he'd studied at home. During a break, Pierre heard snippets of conversations around him, words blending together in a fast, incomprehensible rhythm. He wondered if he'd ever understand or if he'd always be this invisible. The weight of his loneliness settled heavily on his shoulders as he realized how much he longed for someone to talk to, someone who would be patient with his stumbles and mistakes. The bell rang again, signaling the end of the class, and Pierre noticed James waiting for him by the door. "Hey, man, how about we team up for the project?" James asked with a grin. Pierre hesitated, struggling to find the words. "Yes, project, yes," he managed, his voice barely audible. James laughed, a sound that surprisingly didn't feel mocking. "Cool. We'll meet after school. I'll help you with anything you need. See you later, Pierre." As James walked away, Pierre felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps today wouldn't end in silence after all. The final bell echoed through the hallways, and Pierre made his way to the library, feeling both nervous and excited about meeting James. He wondered what to expect. Would James be patient with his broken English? Would he find it exhausting to explain everything? When Pierre arrived, James was already waiting, books and a notebook sprawled out on the table. He waved Pierre over with a cheerful, "Hey, you made it." Pierre nodded, taking a seat across from him. "Thank you for help," he said, hoping the words didn't sound too clumsy. "Of course," James replied, his tone light and welcoming. "Let's start with the project outline, and then we'll tackle anything you don't understand." "Sound good," Pierre nodded, trying to keep up as James explained the project. The language barrier was challenging, but James seemed to sense when Pierre needed clarification, slowing down and simplifying words when necessary. As they worked through the assignment, Pierre found himself relaxing, grateful for James's patience. After a while, James leaned back, eyeing Pierre thoughtfully. "You know, I could help you outside of just this project. We could meet a few times a week if you're interested." Pierre's eyes widened with surprise. "You help more?" he asked, both astonished and relieved. "Absolutely," James replied, smiling. "Learning a language is tough, but it's easier with a friend, right?" Pierre smiled, feeling warmth spread through him. "Yes, friend," he repeated, savoring the word. Their session continued with James explaining words and phrases, sometimes throwing in a joke or two to keep things light. Pierre found himself laughing, the tension in his shoulders easing as they worked. For the first time since arriving, he felt a connection, a sense that perhaps he wasn't as alone as he'd thought. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, they packed up their books. James gave him a friendly slap on the shoulder. "See you tomorrow." Pierre nodded, his English improving just enough for a heartfelt response. "Thank you, James." "You are kind." James shrugged off the thanks with a grin. "It's what friends are for." Walking home, Pierre's mind raced with thoughts of the day. He still had a long way to go in mastering English, but now he had something equally important, a friend who would be there along the way. The next day, Pierre arrived at school feeling a little less anxious. He still didn't understand most of what people said around him, but knowing he'd see James again was a comfort. As he entered the classroom, he noticed James was already there, waving him over to the seat beside him. "Hey, Pierre, ready for round 2? James greeted him with a grin. Pierre nodded, smiling back. "Yes, ready," he replied, feeling a bit more confident with each word. During class, they worked together, and Pierre found himself focusing more on the assignment than on his fears. Every so often, James would lean over and whisper a word or phrase, explaining it quietly so the teacher wouldn't notice. Pierre appreciated how naturally James offered help without making him feel embarrassed or different. After class, James suggested they go to the library again to study, this time for an informal English lesson. Pierre agreed, eager to learn from someone who made the process enjoyable. When they sat down, James took out a list he'd written of common phrases and slang words he thought Pierre might find useful. "Let's make this fun. I'll teach you some phrases, and you teach me a few things in French," James suggested. Pierre's eyes lit up. "Yes. I teach you too." James began with basic phrases, and Pierre quickly realized that learning from him was different from studying in a classroom. They laughed as James attempted a few French phrases, making Pierre feel at ease as he explained the pronunciations. By the end of the session, Pierre had a small list of new English phrases and an unexpected understanding of American humor. As they packed up, James looked at him thoughtfully. "You're doing great, you know. It's hard to move to a new country and learn a language. My cousin lived in Germany for a year, and he said it was the toughest thing he'd ever done." Pierre felt a mix of gratitude and pride. "Thank you, James." I try my best." James smiled and clapped him on the shoulder. "And that's all that matters." As Pierre walked home at evening, he repeated the phrases James had taught him, determined to practice until they felt natural. He thought about how different life had seemed just days ago, and now, with a friend by his side, he felt a glimmer of hope. The following day, as they met in the library again, James had a new idea to make English lessons more enjoyable. "How about we learn through music?" he suggested, holding up his phone with a playlist ready to go. "Music makes everything better." Pierre's eyes lit up with interest. He'd always loved music, though he hadn't considered it as a tool for learning English. "Yes, I like music," he agreed, nodding enthusiastically. James played a popular song, pointing out the lyrics on his phone screen and explaining the meanings of certain phrases. Pierre listened carefully, enjoying the rhythm and energy of the song, even if he didn't understand every word. The lyrics were a mix of familiar and new words, and as he listened, he started to pick out phrases he recognized. "Music is great for learning because you get to hear how words sound together," James explained. "Plus, it's fun." No pressure, they spent the next hour going through different songs, with James explaining slang and expressions Pierre hadn't encountered in his textbooks. By the end, Pierre was humming along, his confidence growing with each line he understood. Music, he realized, was a language of its own, and it bridged the gap between them in a way that nothing else had. James grinned, pleased with Pierre's progress. Hey, you're pretty good. By the time we're done, you'll know more American songs than I do. Pierre laughed, his face lighting up with a smile that came easily now. Maybe I teach you French song next time. I'm up for the challenge, James replied, giving him a thumbs up. Same time tomorrow, Pierre nodded, feeling genuinely excited for the next session. As he walked home, he found himself singing the song they'd practiced, the words swirling in his mind as he repeated them. He knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time he felt that learning English could be enjoyable. He was beginning to see it as something more than just an obstacle. It was a bridge to a new life and a new friend. The next morning, Pierre's usual nervousness before class was replaced by a subtle excitement. He felt a bit more comfortable with each day that passed, especially with James's support. When he took his seat next to James, he caught himself smiling a small, quiet smile that he hadn't felt since arriving in America. Class began, and the teacher assigned a reading exercise. She asked for volunteers, and before Pierre could stop himself, he felt his hand begin to rise. As soon as he realized what he was doing, he froze, surprised by his own bravery. The entire class turned to look at him, and Pierre's face flushed as he realized he had everyone's attention. The teacher smiled encouragingly. Go ahead, Pierre. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he focused on the words. Each syllable felt heavy, his accent thick, but he forced himself to continue, ignoring the whispers he thought he heard. As he finished the last line, there was a moment of silence before the teacher nodded approvingly. Thank you, Pierre, well done, she said. Pierre glanced at James, who gave him an enthusiastic thumbs up, mouthing the word awesome. Pierre couldn't help but feel a surge of pride, despite the nervousness still lingering in his chest. For the first time, he hadn't let fear stop him. After class, Pierre overheard a few students laughing about his accent, and his initial excitement began to fade. Just as he was about to lower his head and walk away, James approached, his expression serious. Hey, don't listen to them. They don't get how hard it is to do what you just did, James said firmly. You were brave, Pierre. That's what counts. Pierre managed a grateful smile, feeling reassured. Thank you, James. I try. You did more than try. You did great, James replied, clapping him on the shoulder. Come on, let's grab lunch. You've earned it. As they headed toward the cafeteria, Pierre felt a sense of confidence he hadn't felt before. Despite the challenges, he was beginning to understand that learning a new language was a journey, and with friends like James by his side, he wasn't alone on this path. Over the next few days, Pierre and James continued meeting, and their study sessions turned into something more than just language practice. James had brought up the idea of a cultural exchange, suggesting that they each share something from their respective countries. Pierre loved the idea, seeing it as a chance to give back and show a bit of his own world to James. Their first exchange session was all about French music. Pierre had picked a few of his favorite songs, ones that reminded him of home. He watched James's face as he listened, the lyrics unfamiliar, but the melody drawing him in. Pierre explained the meaning of each song, doing his best to translate the lyrics into English. The words were sometimes hard to express, but James listened attentively, nodding along. "This is really beautiful," James said, his voice sincere. "I don't understand all the words, but I can feel the emotion in it." Pierre smiled, pleased. Music, it doesn't need words. "It's a feeling, exactly," James replied, "and it's cool to see where you come from. You know, I think a lot of people just see you as the new kid, but it makes me realize how much you bring with you." Hearing that made Pierre's heart swell. He realized that James didn't just see him as someone struggling to learn English. He saw him as someone with a story, a history. In return, Pierre started to ask more questions about American culture, learning about things he'd only seen in movies: Thanksgiving, high school football games, even the excitement around Halloween. They laughed as Pierre tried to pronounce tricky words and phrases, with James patiently correcting him. Pierre also shared some fun facts about France, and their sessions became less about language drills and more about discovering each other's worlds. One evening, as they were packing up their things, James turned to him with a grin. "Hey, how about this weekend we go to a football game? It's a big part of American high school life, and you can get a real taste of what it's like here." Pierre hesitated, the thought of navigating a noisy, crowded stadium feeling overwhelming. But the excitement in James's eyes convinced him to take a chance. "Yes, I would like that. Awesome. I'll pick you up on Friday," James said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Trust me, you'll love it." As Pierre walked home at night, he thought about how far he'd come since his first day. He still had a lot to learn, but he was beginning to realize that this experience wasn't just about English. It was about friendship, about opening up to a new world, and about allowing himself to be seen for who he was. Friday evening arrived, and, true to his word, James picked up Pierre to take him to the high school football game. The stadium was packed with students, parents, and community members, the air filled with the scent of popcorn and the sound of cheering. Pierre felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness as he followed James through the crowd, taking in the lively atmosphere. "Pretty cool, right?" James said, raising his voice over the noise. Pierre nodded, a bit overwhelmed but enjoying the energy. "Yes, very. American, he replied, earning a laugh from James. They found seats among James's friends, and Pierre quickly realized how much of the game's language was lost on him. The cheers, the chants, the sports jargon, it all swirled around him in a blur of unfamiliar sounds. He did his best to follow along, smiling when everyone else cheered, but he felt his confidence fading. Despite his efforts, he still felt like an outsider. During halftime, one of James's friends turned to Pierre, asking him a question he didn't quite understand. When Pierre hesitated, the friend laughed and made a joke about his accent. Others joined in, and Pierre's cheeks burned with embarrassment. He wanted to reply, to defend himself, but the words just wouldn't come. James quickly noticed and stepped in, shooting a glare at his friend. "Hey, that's not cool," he said, standing up for Pierre. Give him a break. English isn't easy. Though grateful for James's defense, Pierre still felt the sting of humiliation. The rest of the game passed in a blur, and by the time they left, he was quieter than usual. On the drive home, James tried to lift his spirits, but Pierre couldn't shake the feeling of inadequacy. He'd thought he was making progress, but tonight had reminded him just how far he still had to go. As he lay in bed that night, Pierre considered giving up on trying to fit in. The idea of facing another day of misunderstandings and jokes made him feel defeated. But deep down, he knew he couldn't let one night erase all the progress he'd made. He resolved to keep trying, even if it meant facing more challenges. The next day, Pierre walked into school with a heavy heart, still feeling the sting of the previous night. He wasn't sure if he'd see James, but part of him hoped his friend would understand the struggle he was facing. As he approached his locker, he noticed James waiting for him, leaning casually against the wall with a friendly smile. "Hey, Pierre," James greeted, his tone casual yet warm. "I was thinking maybe we can hang out again after school today. But just us, you know, none of those guys from last night." Pierre looked at him, a mixture of relief and gratitude on his face. "Thank you, James. I was worried," he admitted, the words coming out in a quiet but honest tone. James shrugged. "Those guys can be jerks sometimes. Don't let them get to you. Trust me, everyone makes mistakes when learning something new." Pierre nodded, feeling a bit more at ease. As the school day went on, he found himself focusing on the words and phrases he learned, reminding himself of the progress he'd made rather than the setback he'd experienced. By the end of the day, he was looking forward to meeting James. After school, they headed to the library, where James pulled out a list of phrases and vocabulary determined to keep Pierre's confidence up. They worked together, reviewing common expressions and even role-playing different situations that Pierre might encounter in daily life. James kept the tone light, cracking jokes and making Pierre laugh until he forgot about the previous night's embarrassment. During their study session, Pierre noticed that James's patience never wavered. He took his time explaining words and would encourage Pierre each time he stumbled. It was clear that James genuinely cared, and that knowledge gave Pierre the strength to continue. As they finished up, James looked at him with a serious expression. Remember, learning a language isn't just about words, it's about being brave enough to make mistakes. You're doing great, Pierre. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Pierre's eyes softened, and he nodded. Yes, I understand. Thank you, James. I will keep trying. James smiled. Good, because you're not alone in this. We're in it together, okay? Pierre felt a renewed sense of determination as he walked home that evening. He knew he'd face more challenges, but with James by his side, he felt ready to confront them. No longer weighed down by last night's doubts, he was ready to embrace each step of his journey, one word at a time. The following week, Pierre found himself slowly settling into a routine. His English was improving bit by bit, and he was becoming more comfortable speaking up in class, especially with James there to support him. But one afternoon, something unexpected happened. In the middle of history class, the teacher announced a school talent show and encouraged everyone to participate. This is a great chance to share something about yourselves with the school community, she said. Looking around the room, Pierre shifted uncomfortably. He'd never considered performing anything, much less in front of a crowd of English-speaking students. But as he glanced over at James, he saw his friend's face light up with excitement. You should totally do it, Pierre, James whispered enthusiastically. Pierre looked at him, startled. Me? I don't know. Why English? Exactly, James interrupted, his grin widening. You could share a bit of your culture, maybe something in French, or even a song we practiced. You're good at music. Pierre's initial instinct was to refuse. The thought of standing on stage in front of the entire school made his heart race, but James's encouragement made him pause. Perhaps this could be an opportunity to show everyone who he really was beyond just the new kid from France. After a moment's hesitation, Pierre nodded. I will think about it, he said quietly. Awesome. I'll help you with whatever you need, James promised, his excitement contagious. Over the next few days, Pierre thought more about the talent show. Each time he hesitated, he reminded himself of the progress he'd made and how much he'd overcome since his arrival. The idea of performing was terrifying, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was his chance to make a lasting impression. Finally, he decided to go for it. He'd sing a song in English, one of the songs he and James had practiced together. It felt like a perfect way to blend his journey of learning the language with his love for music. The day of the talent show arrived, and Pierre was a bundle of nerves. As he waited backstage, he could hear the murmur of the crowd and the occasional burst of laughter as other students performed. He took deep breaths, reminding himself of the hours he'd spent practicing, with James's encouragement echoing in his mind. When his turn finally came, he stepped out onto the stage, squinting against the bright lights. The auditorium seemed enormous, with hundreds of faces staring back at him. His hands trembled as he gripped the microphone, and for a brief moment, he wondered if he could actually go through with it. But then he spotted James in the crowd, giving him an enthusiastic thumbs up, mouthing, "You've got this." Summoning all his courage, Pierre began to sing. His voice wavered at first, his accent heavy on certain words, but he pushed forward, pouring his emotions into each line. As the song went on, he felt his confidence growing. He wasn't just singing in English, he was sharing his journey, his struggles, and his triumphs. The audience listened in silence, and as he reached the final verse, he felt a surge of pride. He'd done it. He'd stood up in front of everyone and shown them a piece of himself, unfiltered and real. When he finished, there was a brief pause before the applause erupted. The clapping and cheers filled the room, and Pierre felt a wave of relief and happiness wash over him. He'd not only performed, he'd conquered a fear he'd never thought he'd be able to face. As he walked off stage, a few students approached him with congratulations, some complimenting his accent and bravery. Pierre beamed, grateful for their words, but one comment stood out. One of James's friends approached him and gave him a nod. "Hey, that was actually really good. Respect." Pierre could hardly believe his ears. The same friend who had made fun of him at the football game now looked at him with genuine admiration. For the first time, Pierre felt truly accepted. After the show, James found him and pulled him into a hug. "You were amazing, Pierre. I knew you could do it." Pierre smiled, the gratitude evident in his eyes. "Thank you, James. I could not have done it without you." "Nonsense. You had it in you all along," James replied, grinning. And now the whole school knows it. As they left the auditorium together, Pierre realized that he'd gained far more than just language skills. He'd found courage, friendship, and a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in a long time. In the days following the talent show, Pierre noticed a significant change in how he was perceived by his classmates. People who had once overlooked him now greeted him in the hallways, and a few even stopped to ask him questions about the song he performed. It was subtle, but Pierre felt the shift of sense that he was no longer an outsider, but someone people recognized and respected. Despite this newfound confidence, Pierre knew there was still more to learn. He continued meeting with James every afternoon, determined to improve his English skills. One day, during their usual session in the library, the English teacher approached their table with a warm smile. "Pierre, you've been doing wonderfully," she said. "In fact, I'd like you to give a short speech to the class next week. Think of it as a chance to share your experiences here and maybe a bit about your life in France. It doesn't have to be long, just a few minutes." Pierre's stomach churned at the thought of speaking in front of his classmates again. Singing had been one thing, but standing up and talking about himself felt far more intimidating. He looked at James, searching for reassurance. James gave him a supportive smile. "You can do this, Pierre. Besides, everyone already saw how awesome you were at the talent show. This will be a piece of cake." Pierre hesitated, but finally nodded. He knew it was another step he needed to take, even if it scared him. Over the next few days, he and James worked on his speech, crafting each line carefully. They practiced in the empty library, with James correcting his pronunciation and offering encouragement. As the day of the speech approached, Pierre's nerves grew, but he reminded himself of all the progress he'd made. This speech wasn't just a classroom assignment, it was a chance to show everyone how far he'd come. When the day arrived, Pierre's hands felt cold and his heart raced as he stood at the front of the classroom. His classmates looked at him with a mix of curiosity and encouragement, and he took a deep breath, recalling the hours he'd spent practicing with James. He started slowly, his voice shaking slightly as he introduced himself and shared his experience of moving to a new country. He spoke about the challenges of learning English, the isolation he'd felt at first, and how difficult it had been to understand even the simplest conversations. His words were simple, but he poured his heart into each one, determined to convey what his journey had meant to him. As he continued, he began to relax, the words flowing more easily. He talked about meeting James and how their friendship had changed everything for him. He even managed a small joke about his accent, earning a few laughs from the class. The sound of their laughter filled him with a sense of belonging he hadn't felt before. When he finished, there was a moment of silence, and then the room burst into applause. Pierre felt a wave of relief and pride wash over him, realizing that he'd once again faced his fears and triumphed. As he returned to his seat, James leaned over and whispered, "See, I told you you were amazing." Pierre smiled, his confidence bolstered by the experience. He'd not only managed to speak in front of the class, but he'd also shared a piece of himself with them. It was a moment of victory, a step forward in his journey to finding his place in this new world. After class, several students approached him to congratulate him on his speech, and one even invited him to join their study group. Pierre accepted gratefully, feeling his world expand as he continued to connect with the people around him. It was a small step, but for Pierre, it marked a turning point, a moment when he realized he was no longer just the new kid from France, but someone with a voice, a story, and a place in this community. With each passing week, Pierre felt more at home, both in school and in his friendship with James. Their study sessions had evolved beyond English practice. They now spent hours discussing everything from their favorite movies to their dreams for the future. Pierre found himself opening up in ways he hadn't anticipated, sharing stories about his family and France, his favorite places to visit, and the life he'd left behind. One evening, as they were finishing up a particularly long study session, James turned to him with a curious look. "Hey, Pierre, have you thought about what you want to do after high school?" Pierre hesitated, unsure how to answer. I don't know. Maybe university. Maybe go back to France or stay here. I'm not sure yet." James nodded thoughtfully. "You'd be great here, you know that, right? You've come so far in just a few months. Imagine what you could do with a few more years." Pierre looked down, a small smile on his face. "Thanks, James. I never thought I would feel this way. I used to think I didn't belong here, but now it feels like home." Double quotes James grinned, giving him a friendly nudge. "That's because you do belong here. You're part of this place now, Pierre. You've got friends, and you've got people who care about you." The conversation left Pierre feeling reflective, and as he walked home at night, he thought about how much his life had changed. He'd come to America feeling lost and alone, but now he had friends, a sense of purpose, and a confidence he hadn't known he was capable of. Their bond had grown deeper than simple friendship. James had become like family to Pierre, a constant source of support and encouragement. And for Pierre, that meant everything. He knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he wouldn't be facing them alone. As the school year continued, the English teacher announced that the class would participate in a public speaking competition. Each student was encouraged to submit a short presentation on a topic of their choice, with the winner going on to represent the school at a regional event. When the teacher explained the guidelines, Pierre felt a familiar twist of anxiety in his stomach. Speaking in front of the class was one thing, but this was a school-wide event. After class, James turned to him, his eyes shining with excitement. "Pierre, you have to do this. You've already spoken in front of the class. You can totally handle this." Pierre hesitated. The idea of speaking in front of an even larger crowd was daunting, but then he remembered the sense of accomplishment he'd felt after his class speech. Maybe this was his chance to push himself further. "I don't know," he admitted, "but maybe I will try." James grinned, clapping him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit. We'll practice together. You'll crush it. I know you will." Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly on Pierre's presentation. They chose a topic close to his heart, the experience of moving to a new country and learning to find one's place in a foreign land. Pierre poured himself into the speech, writing and rewriting each line with James's guidance. They practiced in the library with James offering feedback on his pronunciation and delivery. Finally, the day of the competition arrived. As Pierre stood backstage, waiting for his turn to speak, he felt the familiar mix of excitement and nerves. He glanced out at the audience, spotting James in the front row, giving him a reassuring smile. When Pierre's name was called, he stepped onto the stage, gripping the edges of the podium as he began his speech. His voice trembled at first, but he quickly found his rhythm, letting the words flow naturally. He spoke about the challenges he'd faced, the isolation he'd felt, and the friendships that had changed his life. Each sentence was filled with genuine emotion, and as he looked into the audience, he saw familiar faces nodding along, connecting with his story. By the time he finished, there was a moment of silence, followed by applause that filled the auditorium. Pierre felt a surge of pride and relief wash over him. He'd done it, he'd faced his fears, spoken his truth, and shared a piece of himself with the world. Afterward, James rushed up to him, practically beaming. "You were incredible, Pierre." "I knew you could do it." Pierre smiled, feeling a warmth he couldn't put into words. "Thank you, James. I never would have done it without you." James shook his head. "No way, man. This was all you. You had it in you from the start." As they left the auditorium, Pierre knew that he'd not only succeeded in the competition, but had also overcome a personal challenge he'd once thought impossible. He felt ready for whatever the future held, knowing that he had the courage to face any obstacle that came his way. Pierre's victory in the school competition was a defining moment, but the real test lay ahead, the regional public speaking event. The thought of speaking in front of an even larger audience made Pierre's nerves return with a vengeance, but he was determined to see it through. The day of the event arrived all too quickly, and Pierre found himself backstage at a local auditorium, waiting for his name to be called. James was there by his side, offering words of encouragement. "Remember, Pierre, you've done this before. Just tell your story like you always do. Everyone's going to love it." Pierre nodded, taking a deep breath to steady himself. As he stepped onto the stage and approached the podium, he scanned the audience, finding James's face in the crowd. His friend gave him an enthusiastic thumbs up, and Pierre felt a surge of confidence. He began his speech slowly, carefully enunciating each word. His story of moving to a foreign country, learning a new language, and finding friendship resonated deeply with the audience. With every sentence, Pierre became more comfortable, pouring his emotions into the words. He spoke about the loneliness he had felt, the challenge of navigating an unfamiliar world, and the incredible support he'd found in James and others who'd helped him along the way. As he reached the end, Pierre took a moment to look out at the audience. Learning a language is more than just understanding words. It's about finding a voice, connecting with others, and discovering who you are. "Thank you." The applause that erupted was loud and heartfelt, and Pierre felt an overwhelming sense of relief and pride. He had shared his journey, and in doing so, he had inspired others. As he left the stage, he was greeted by James, who wrapped him in a tight hug. "Pierre, that was incredible." "I'm so proud of you," James said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. Pierre smiled, his gratitude evident. "Thank you, James. I couldn't have done it without you." "No, you would have." "This was all you," James replied, giving him a reassuring pat on the back. "But hey, I'm glad I got to be a part of it." Pierre knew that this moment marked the culmination of his journey. He had come to America feeling lost and uncertain, but he was leaving that stage with a sense of belonging and a friend who had changed his life. As the weeks passed, Pierre settled back into his daily life, but everything felt different. He was no longer just the new kid or the exchange student. He was Pierre, someone with a story, a voice, and a place in this new world. His classmates treated him with a newfound respect, and he was even invited to join study groups and clubs, something he'd once thought impossible. One afternoon, as he and James sat in their usual spot in the library, Pierre turned to his friend. "James, I've been thinking, maybe next year I could help other students like me students who come from other countries." James's eyes lit up. "That's a great idea, Pierre. You'd be perfect for that. You know what it's like to be in their shoes." Pierre nodded, feeling a sense of purpose. "I want to give back the way you helped me. Maybe I can make it easier for someone else to find their place." They spent the rest of the afternoon discussing plans for how Pierre could mentor new students, offering support to those who might feel just as lost as he had felt on his first day. The idea filled Pierre with excitement, and he realized that his journey was far from over. He had the opportunity not only to continue growing, but also to help others along the way. On the last day of the school year, Pierre stood outside the building, looking up at the familiar walls that had once felt so intimidating. James stood beside him, a grin on his face. "Look at you, Pierre, you've come so far." Pierre smiled, feeling a mixture of pride and gratitude. "Thank you, James, for everything. You're more than just a friend, you're like family to me." James chuckled, pulling him into a hug. "Same here, Pierre." "Same here." As they walked away from the school, Pierre knew that his story was only just beginning. He had faced challenges, overcome fears, and forged a bond that would last a lifetime. And as he looked toward the future, he felt ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing he had the strength, the courage, and the friendship to carry him forward.